friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the television show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm Elliott Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We're delighted to have forensic psychologist Dr. Joseph Wyatt with us here today to talk to us about his newest book, which is a fantastic look at the inside of true crime fiction and the role that forensic psychology plays in crime investigation and prosecution. The book is called The Breaking Point Killing and Other True Cases of Murder and Malice, and Dr. Wyatt is with us today. He has been a forensic psychologist for more than 30 years. He served as an expert witness and a consultant to attorneys on dozens of cases involving criminal investigation, and The Breaking Point Killing is going to take you, and we'll talk about it, through some of those most important and most memorable cases for him. Dr. Wyatt retired after 30 plus years of teaching at Marshall University, and he's also the author of The Millennium Man and B.F. Skinner from A to Z, both of those books published by Third Millennium Press. And Dr. Wyatt, we're delighted to have you here today. Welcome to Chapters.
It's great to be here, Elliott. Thank you so much.
Tell me a little bit before we get started on your book. You know, we see so much about TV versions of what forensic psychologists do and what that profession is, but I know that some of that is Hollywoodized a little bit, and some of it's actually true. What is the field of forensic psychology? What does a forensic psychologist actually do?
Well, a forensic psychologist, Elliott, what that means is the role of psychology in the study of behavior as it relates to the court system and the legal process. And so there are several things that a forensic psychologist does, typically. One of them is answering questions about competence and responsibility. For example, when a defendant is referred to me by an attorney, usually the question involves, the attorney has some reason to think that there are problems with the individual's competence to stand trial or responsibility at the time of the crime. So, for example, a person who is low functioning intellectually may have been led into a crime by smarter people and, maybe wasn't responsible for what he did in this crime, or maybe became psychotic and heard voices telling him to do this crime. And so we do have in America a provision for people who are not guilty by reason of insanity. So that answers the question of responsibility. Now, I will tell you, and there's a lot of misunderstanding, only in about 1% of all cases is the insanity defense raised. Although if you ask people, they think it's about every third time. And of the times that the insanity defense is raised, it's only a successful defense about 1/3 of those. So it's maybe one case in 300 where someone is found not guilty by reason of insanity. But those cases have meaning. The other question is this question of competence, meaning we don't put somebody on trial if that person is not competent to participate in his own defense. So, for example, if a person is still psychotic, mumbling to himself, unable to consult with his attorney, a judge may conclude that he is not competent to stand trial. So, in that case, he would be remanded to a secure mental health facility until he is competent to stand trial. In the case of someone not guilty by reason of insanity, same thing happens. If a jury finds him not guilty, you're not going to bump into him tomorrow walking down the street. He is going to be remanded to a secure psychiatric facility, and if in the future he becomes in touch with reality, then he could go to trial. So we have all kinds of things like that, and it's been a very, very interesting career for me. The cases that I describe in the book, and there are 11 of them, plus there are 2 chapters additional that deal generally with the field of forensic psychology. Those are all cases I worked on, most of them from the Huntington to Charleston, West Virginia area and south. Some of them expand a little further in West Virginia. There's one in Princeton, one in Fairmont, and here and there. But they're all real cases, and they've all been concluded and adjudicated. So they are in the true crime genre, but they're real. They're not fiction. So there you go.
How did you get involved in this in terms of being someone available to testify in court. Was that something that comes along with your profession, or was that something you had to sort of promote yourself to do that? How did all that happen for you?
Elliott, it goes back to fairly soon after I became a faculty member at Marshall in 1980. I began getting calls from attorneys asking if I could help them. So it wasn't a specialty area for me, forensic psychology, in my training, but I made myself an expert by working with attorneys, expanding my reading, and eventually I became actually a trainer of some people who do these kinds of this kind of work. But then as one case led to another, it just built, and there you go. And I was still teaching psychology every week at Marshall, but I had this kind of interest area, and that's how that happened.
You mentioned 11 cases in this book, the Breaking Point killing. Some of them are featured here on the back, and some of them are so interesting. And I thought I'd just ask you about a couple of them,
Sure.
and you could tell us a little bit about what happened from what you remember and your role in this process. The first one that really caught my attention was about a gentleman named Nick Morrow, and I think I'm pronouncing his name right,
Yes.
from Fairmont, West Virginia, who murdered his brother's family, and then he was faced with life in prison, and he attempted to fake sort of a dissociative disorder, which ties into what you were saying a few minutes ago about this idea of insanity and competency to stand trial. What kind of went on there from what you remember, and what was your role, and ultimately what happened to him?
Well, Nick Morrow's attorneys, two very good attorneys up in Fairmont, called me, and they said, there is no question Nick Morrow did murder 4 people. And Nick Morrow was in his mid-50s. He was, for lack of a better term, a guy who was kind of lost, saw himself as a sort of a loser who always wanted to be a big shot wheeler dealer, in contrast to his brother, who was a very successful businessman married with 2 grown sons. Nick, his lawyers told me over the phone, had a history of psychosis 6 years prior, and he had actually been admitted to the psychiatric unit at West Virginia University Hospital, where he had had all kinds of ideas and hallucinations and delusions and such. So they thought, let's have him examined by a forensic psychologist to see if maybe he was psychotic at the time that he killed his brother's family. And I examined Nick. I drove to Fairmont, and I went to the courthouse where his lawyers arranged for me to see him in a side room. He was brought from the jail next door. And at first he was cordial and so on, and it is a little creepy to be sitting across the table examining someone who's murdered 4 people. I saw him 5 times. Morning, afternoon session, next day, same thing. But at about the second session, he began to pretend that he was having a dissociative disorder. That is, pretending that he thought it was 35 years prior, and that the courthouse, I said, where do you think this place is, Nick? He said, well, I'm at the bank, and you're Mr. So-and-so, and I'm here to get a loan to buy a washer-dryer, and he just went on with that. And what tipped me off to his faking in the beginning was that it seemed kind of corny, more like a movie version of what this disorder would be. So I began to ask him questions. Who's the governor? He was wrong about that. You know, ask him what's the year, and he gave me a year in the 1960s. Who's the governor? He was wrong. And several other questions like that. So I sent him back to the jail, went to his attorney's office, which was down the street, and said, look, you need to set him down and tell him that if there's going to be any help for him, he needs to be straightforward. Mm-hmm. And so they did that and called me back, and I examined him several more sessions, and he was very apologetic and so on and so forth. So, but in the end, Nick Morrow, as I felt sure he would be, was found guilty. Now, my opinion was that he was not psychotic when he did these killings, but I don't think he went to his brother's home that day to kill his brother. I think he went there to borrow money, yet again, His brother finally cut him off. They had words. Nick Morrow, had a gun in his pocket, pulled it out, shot his brother dead, and then ended up shooting 3 other family members. And as they came home one by one. So Nick Morrow went to trial down in Beckley. They got a change of venue because the now dead family had a good reputation in the community. They were business people. And then I gave some testimony, and I said, I don't think he went there with the intention of killing his brother, and the jury actually believed that. So they found him guilty of second-degree murder, not first-degree murder on that count. But the other 3 killings, first-degree murder all the way. It only takes one of those to lock a person up for life in West Virginia. And of course, we aren't a capital punishment state, so there was no electric chair in the future. And Nick Morrow then went to prison, and he was there for many years until one day he got sick, was taken to CAMC Hospital in Charleston, and died a couple of days later.
Interesting. It was a fascinating case because, as you pointed out, when you read that, you don't get a real sense that he meant to kill his brothers and his family. It's just one of those things that one thing led to another, and it sort of ended up with that result, but that maybe that wasn't his original
It's
intention.
really true. And if there was on the day this all happened, it's really pretty horrible. What Nick did was he was living in a motel up in across the river in Westover, I think. And he was there with his wife, and she had a 12-year-old daughter by a previous marriage, and the 2 of them had a 3-year-old little boy whose birthday it was that day. And Nick, if there was any hero in it, it was Mrs. Morrow. When Nick came home, I interviewed her too, as I usually interview some family members. Nick came home to the motel room, and she told me later he didn't look quite right, but they went to Shoney's and they had a birthday dinner. But what Nick had done, he had gone to Walmart or Kmart or somewhere, and he bought 4 sleeping bags and a couple of 10-gallon gas containers. And I think his plan was to take these bodies, which were still in the living room of the house, and take them out to the country and burn them. But the police caught him before that. And the way they caught him was because of evidence at the crime scene. And they figured out that he was at that motel. They went there, but they were afraid to charge in because they felt that he could kill his wife, the 2 children, and then himself. And we hear those things happening sometimes. So they got on the phone with Mrs. Morrow at about 5 o'clock in the morning and said, turn on the TV, and she did. And here's the news about all this going on. And she kept her cool. She talked with Nick. Sometimes she prayed, she said. She read stories to the children to try to calm them. And she convinced Nick that he should talk to the priest. And the police got a priest out there, and they talked him into letting his wife and children go, and then he came out.
Interesting.
So not a horrible end as it could have been.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you about another case that I found really interesting, this one out of Princeton, involving a realtor named James Constantino, who believed he had inherited millions. And this was such an interesting story. But after he learned that instead of getting inheritance, he had actually been scammed out of hundreds of thousands of dollars, he sort of went into a paranoid psychosis and committed a murder. What happened there? How did he at first think he inherited millions, then got scammed out of hundreds of thousands, which led to murder? What happened there?
And Elliott, this was a true case of a person who killed in a psychotic episode, I'm convinced. And Mr. Constantino is still alive. He's still in prison at this time. He will get out in a while. This case happened, I think a little more than 10 years ago, maybe between 10 and 15 years ago, as I recall. James Constantino was a very well-respected man in Princeton, West Virginia. He was a school teacher in the county school system down there for many years, had been director then for a while of the Concord University then Concord College Upward Bound program, which tries to connect, as you know, I'm sure, high school students with colleges, to especially high school students who maybe haven't had advantages at home, but they have the ability to go to college, to try to get them to go to college. On the side, he began selling real estate. He was quite successful at it and had a good business, and in time he quit his teaching job. So Mr. Constantino, in time, became a successful realtor as a result of starting out part-time, owned a business, and it sold half the real estate in the county down there in Princeton. And so that was going well, but one day he got a fax informing him that a long-lost relative in Africa had left him $15 million in inheritance, and that if he would only send so many $1,000s to a certain ministry and the government in Africa, that they would send him his money. Now, Elliott, you may have gotten things like that. I have several times inherited millions of dollars from somebody in Africa that I didn't know, some long-lost relative. It smacked of scam from end to end. Why he took the bait, smart guy, I have no idea, but he did. And before it was over, he had given these folks quite a bit of money, tens of thousands, and he figured out something was wrong, but at the same time, he demanded that these people send him some of the money. And they said, oh, we've finally shaken this money loose. We'll be sending it to you in bits and pieces. But they sent him checks, 3 of them, one right after the other, in the amount of $65,000 to $75,000, and he put them in his bank account. But they sent instructions saying, now, what we've done is really gotten an advance from certain people on this money. You need to put it in your bank account and then immediately write a check to these other people to pay them back for their advance, and then we'll send you the money. What he was actually doing was laundering money through his own bank account, which these people had stolen a checkbook. The scammers were not in Africa. They were somewhere up in New Jersey, I think. And they had stolen a checkbook from a Jesuit school up there, like a prep school, saying all of the money in these matters has to be channeled through some U.S. entity, and this Jesuit school has agreed to do that for a small percentage. So it just got worse. He had a visit from the FBI. The Jesuit school had discovered this, and from their perspective, he was just writing checks that were stolen from their checkbook, and he was in a lot of trouble. That's when his paranoia began, and before it was over, he became completely paranoid. He got a good lawyer, a man named Michael Gibson, down there in Princeton, and Mr. Gibson got in touch with me because when Mr. Constantino was jailed, he began acting psychotic, but he wasn't jailed until after family members and his partner, his domestic partner, had begun saying, you're getting kind of not right here. You need to get some psychiatric help. He had gone to see a psychiatrist and a counselor, and then he didn't get better, and he kept getting more and more paranoid, and his lawyer helped him deal with the charges, and the FBI finally figured out that he was really a victim too, and he agreed to make restitution, and so it was kind of all worked out, but he didn't believe it. He became so psychotic that he began thinking that somebody in New Jersey was still going to come after him, mafia people, I don't know, the scammers, and so his mental status just continued to decline, Elliott. And as the months played out, and this all took a year or two, he got worse and worse, and he couldn't take care of his realty business. I spoke with his brother. I spoke with the woman who was more or less the office manager in the realty business, and they told me, they said, his office manager said he became just non-functional. He'd be on the phone talking about a realty deal, and she would have to listen with her ear at the phone and write notes to tell him what to say, and it just got worse and worse. He wouldn't go out to do grocery shopping until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning because he didn't want people to see him. So there were all kinds of stressors upon him, Elliott, that most of us would never undergo. There was the scam, the incredible loss of his own bank account because he had to make restitution to this school in New Jersey to stay out of jail. There was his loss of esteem in the community. He was a gay person, and his office manager and his brother both told me he's the only one that thinks he's still in the closet. Everybody knows he's gay. They love him in the community. He's well respected. And it was just a horrible situation. As his paranoia got worse and his partner began to say, "You've got to get help. I can't take this anymore." He wasn't cleaning up every day. He wasn't taking care of personal hygiene, wasn't taking care of his business, wasn't taking care of his house. He continued to tell people that others were watching him, coming to get him. They're coming after me. So finally, his domestic partner there said, "If you don't get some serious help, maybe inpatient treatment, I don't know if I can take it anymore." And so, not long after that, Mr. Constantino woke up one day. He had a gun that he had taken from his parents' home. They were elderly but still living in the area. And he took the gun and got up one morning, ate his breakfast, went upstairs. His partner was still in bed asleep, laid down by the partner. He told me, Mr. Constantino later, when I examined him, told me that his mind was racing with all these thoughts, people coming to get him, his esteem was gone, people might find out he was gay, which was common knowledge anyway, and on and on. His partner would leave him, and he got up out of the bed and pointed the gun at his partner and shot him dead. He walked around in the house for 2 days with his partner's dead body, sometimes going to the body as it lay in bed, shouting at it to get up. He told me thinking maybe he could undo this horrible thing. Of course, that was not possible. Finally, on the 3rd day, he called 911, and I've reproduced the 911 call verbatim in the book, and police came out. Of course, he was arrested. A few days later, while he was incarcerated, he was saying that he thought the correctional officers at the jail were plotting to steal his home and all kinds of paranoid thoughts. And that's when his lawyer got in touch with me. I examined him, and by the time I saw him, he was coming out of the fog, so to speak, the paranoid fog. But I rendered my opinion, wrote my report, sent it to his lawyer, and I said, look, he was clearly psychotic when this happened. So his lawyer worked out a deal with the prosecutor, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that James Constantino had a very fine reputation in his community as a solid educator and businessman, and he did a plea deal to second-degree murder, which means that he could get parole in time, and I think that will happen in coming up probably within a year or two, because he's been in there well over 10 years now. So that was a very, very interesting case. I don't think he'll be a danger to his community anymore. That's not the kind of case where there's any good served much good by having him locked up to the end of his days.
Interesting. And I think that's what's so interesting about this entire book, Joe, is that there's all kinds of these stories with all these different circumstances and dynamics. And as you mentioned earlier, it's all true. And we hear that adage sometimes, truth is better than fiction, stuff that really goes on. But these are real people from the state who are going through these various issues. I wanted to ask you about putting this collection of stories together. What was the process like? How did you draft it? How did you revise it? What was the process like getting all this information collected and put together in a book?
Well, what I did was when I retired, I'd always known I wanted to write this book. And I retired about a year and a half ago from my faculty position at Marshall. And this was my first big retirement project. And Elliott, I knew at the time there were certain cases, this would be one of them, and the Nick Morrow case that we talked about already would be one of them. But I went through all my files, and would you believe I had been involved in some way or other in somewhere between 900 and 1,000 cases in my career, but probably 200 to 300 of them were what I would call more than just routine. And of those, then I picked out these 11 cases as some of the more interesting ones. And so the process involved, Elliott, just going back through, once I picked out the 11 cases, and I would sit down on an evening and read the case file to get my brain back into the details of it, and then the next day start writing the chapter. And that involved sometimes getting in touch with the lawyers whom I'd worked with, even though some of them, it was many years before. The oldest case maybe is between 20 and 25 years, and the most recent one just last year. And maybe getting a fix on some of the details and see if they had updates from the years that had ensued. But just reading about the cases again, Elliott, and reading my reports that I had rendered and see if I had any questions, any further questions, and reading everything in the files that I could in my case files. And then I would type that chapter. And then, of course, anybody listening that wants to write a book, my advice is do not do that without a good editor. So Patrick Grace served as my editor, as you know, and he would do an edit, send it back to me, and then I'd make some changes based on his recommendations. And then, but even before I sent it to him, I usually typed the chapter and then went back and probably did about 5 or 6 edits myself before I sent it to him. And then we did it like that, chapter by chapter, so that by the time I did the last chapter, the others were done, and that was that.
Interesting, very good. In our final moments with you, Joe, I wanted to let you have an opportunity to read an excerpt from your book, which will give the audience an idea of sort of the not only just the writing style, but the direction that you use to set up a variety of these different cases, which are also interesting. So I will turn the floor over to you for the next few minutes and set the scene for us, if you would. What are you going to be reading from, and what's going on in the passages that you're reading?
And so that people won't immediately hit the clicker when they hear that I'm going to read, I will read just one page, and I will read the first page from the Nick Morrow case. Let me find that chapter real quick. Page 43, I think. For more than 20 years, Ruann Cabral had lived across Gilbob Street from the James Morrow family in her upscale Fairmont, West Virginia neighborhood. At 1:50 on the afternoon of July 21st, 2002, she noticed Morrow standing in his driveway and a man in gray pants and white shirt walking up. A moment later, Cabral heard what sounded like firecrackers. She saw her neighbor fall into the arms of the man in the white shirt. As James Morrow fell, the other man grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him into the garage. Ruann Cabral heard the man in the white shirt say, "I told you, Jimmy, don't mess with me." Moments later, the garage door closed. Cabral then heard 2 more bangs. The man in the white shirt was James Morrow's brother, Nicholas Nick Morrow, age 48. Over the next several hours, Ruann saw nothing more of her neighbor. Instead, she saw Nick Morrow leave the house and return several times in James' blue Pontiac. She continued watching until an hour or 2 later, during one of Nick Morrow's return trips to the house, James Morrow's wife Frances arrived and entered. Immediately, Ruann Cabral heard the sharp sounds of what she again thought might be firecrackers. Moments later, James and Frances Morrow's grown son Jeff arrived at the home and walked through the front door. Ruann Cabral heard more bangs. Ruann's husband Jim had seen and heard some of the activities too. As soon as Frances, got in the door, it was bang bang, he said. Then Jeff went in and it was bang bang again. I thought the boys were playing around. Neither Ruanne Cabral nor her husband called police. I wasn't thinking murder because out where we live, it's a nice community, she said later. Nick Morrow had shot 4 people to death. They were his brother, James Morrow Sr., age 51, James's wife, Frances, 48, and their 2 grown sons, James II, 26, and Jeff, 22. In the garage, 2 bodies lay under a car cover. 2 others were in the living room, hidden beneath a second car cover. The 4 had been shot 16 times over a couple of hours. Other neighbors, beside the Cabrals, also had heard firecracker sounds. Finally, one of them called police around 9 p.m. One of the great tragedies of this case is that if the individual across the street who saw the first shooting had picked up the phone and called 911, 3 other innocent people would be alive today.
Interesting. Fascinating story. Fascinating collection of titles. And Joe, if one of our audience viewers wants to get in contact with you or get a copy of your book, The Breaking Point Killing, how can they reach you and where can they get a copy of your book?
Well, they can get a copy of the book at various bookstores here at Empire Books. Books A Million has it or will have it. I think Taylor Books in Charleston will have it, and various other places around and about. The book also has a website in which they can read Chapter 1, which we didn't talk about, for free. And the website is found at http:// Wyatt, my name, Wyatt54.wix.com/breaking point killing. It's all one word.
Very good. Dr. Joe Wyatt has been our guest today, author of The Breaking Point Killing and Other True Cases of Murder and Malice. 11 cases set here in West Virginia. As a West Virginia forensic psychologist remembers 11 of his most interesting cases. Joe, it's a fantastic collection of true crime stories, and we appreciate you coming on to talk about it, and we wish you all the best of luck in future writing projects.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to chat with you today.
And we also want to take a moment to say thanks to Charlotte McCoy and the staff and management at Empire Books and News for all their support and assistance with this episode of Chapters and every episode of Chapters that we air here on Armstrong Television. We encourage you to stop by Empire Books and News, pick up a copy of Joe Wyatt's book, The Breaking Point Killing, and also many of the other authors, editors, and publishers that have been featured here on Chapters have their books for sale right here at Empire Books and News at Pullman Square. So we encourage you to stop by and check that out. And if you have a question, comment, or suggestion about this Chapters program or any Chapters program you've seen here on Armstrong Cable, we'd like to make that available to you right now at the address that pops up here at the bottom of the screen. It's lp4@zoominternet.net, so please keep the feedback coming. And if you want to go back and check out a previous episode of Chapters, we've made that available to you through YouTube and the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube. All you need to do is go to www.youtube.com/Armstrong One Wire. From there, click on the Chapters tab, and all of our episodes are archived there for your viewing pleasure right there through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube. And we know many of you have gone back and taken a look at those and left comments in the comments fields, and we appreciate that so much. And if you're a writer or a future writer and you want an opportunity to showcase your work, Empire Books and News is now sponsoring an open mic event on the third Monday of each month right here at Empire Books and News. It's called Writers Can Read, and it takes place from 6 o'clock until 7:30. Each and every Monday on the third Monday of each month right here at Empire Books and News. You don't need to be a published writer or have anything ready for publication. Just if you're working on something and you'd like to share that with an audience of readers and folks that are interested in reading in books and literature, you have that opportunity. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.